Hey everyone, today we will be looking into various tales of women who at first glance had it all, but behind the glittering facade of high society was a darker tale. From heiresses driven to madness by scandal, to socialites who lost their grip on reality. Join me as we uncover the shocking stories of glamour, downfall and insanity that shook the elite. Mary Lincoln was the wife of the famed American president, Abraham Lincoln. She was the first lady, was wealthy enough, and had a nice family, but in 1875, her own son had her sent to an insane asylum. So what happened to her? Was she really mad? And why did her son do this? To answer these questions, we first need to go back to the early 19th century. The woman who is primarily known today as the wife of Abraham Lincoln was born as Mary Ann Todd on the 13th of December 1818 in the town of Lexington in Kentucky. Her father was Robert Smith Todd, a man whose ancestors had played a prominent role in the American Revolutionary War. Robert had trained as a lawyer in his youth, but never went into private practice, instead starting various business ventures in Kentucky on what was then the American frontier. He also fought in the War of 1812 against the British, and it was around this time that he married his wife and Mary's mother, Elizabeth Todd. Yet, Mary's mother would sadly die owing to complications from childbirth when Mary was just 6 years old. The following year, Robert remarried, this time to an Elizabeth Humphreys. This second union would result in 9 children, so the Todd family was a large one. Still, they had the financial means for it to be comfortable all the same, with their family living in a large residence with 14 rooms in the centre of Lexington. Mary was also afforded a good education for the time, with an emphasis on languages, the classics, dancing, music, and social etiquette. In other ways, her youth was difficult though, with her relationship with her stepmother being strained, and also being outnumbered by her many half-siblings. Kentucky was a slave-owning state, and the Todds were no different in this respect. At one point, they enslaved over a dozen people, mostly household workers of one kind or another. Their position in this regard reflected the conflicts which slavery was creating as a whole across the country. Eventually, the Todds would largely renounce slavery, but they lived on the frontier, where it was a controversial issue. In the middle decades of the 19th century, an uneasy agreement had been reached whereby the northern states on the east coast, like New Jersey, New York, Boston, and Connecticut, were becoming free states, where slavery was prohibited, while the southern states on the east coast like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia continued to have their economies and societies based around slavery. But the real issue was whether or not the new states which were being admitted into the Union should be allowed to practice slavery. Kentucky and Tennessee were the first of these frontier states, but by the time Mary Todd was growing up in the 1820s and 1830s, the debate had moved further west to places like Missouri. These tensions would play a major role in Mary Todd's adult life. In 1839, when she was in her early 20s, Mary had moved to Springfield, the capital state of Illinois, a region which was experiencing a major influx of migrants in the 1830s and 1840s. Here she was regarded as a witty, outgoing young woman and was popular among the city's gentry. Initially, she was courted by the rising young lawyer and Democratic Party politician Stephen A. Douglas, but it was also at this time that she met Abraham Lincoln. At the time, Lincoln was a 30-year-old lawyer in Springfield, one who was not well known and had not entered into a political career yet. The two soon became close, but the relationship was peculiar. They soon agreed to marry, however they hesitated afterwards, with Lincoln becoming uncertain about the marriage and even calling it off at one point. Nevertheless, they would eventually wed on the 4th of November 1842 after a relatively long courtship by the standards of the 19th century. Despite its seemingly unusual beginning, Mary's marriage to Abraham was a happy one. They would have several sons, Robert born in 1843, followed by Edward 3 years later. Yet Edward would tragically die before his 4th birthday, owing to tuberculosis. 2 more sons followed, William born in 1850 and Thomas in 1853. The pair were also quite eccentric in their own ways. Lincoln was a mild-mannered and often distracted figure. His boys were known to go into the office, disrupting the business of his law partners. They frequently complained to Abraham about this, but he wouldn't do anything to fix the situation. For her part, Mary was a troubled woman in many ways. She had frequent mood swings, public outbursts, and a fierce temper. If she was living today, she would have been treated for one mental health ailment or another, but in the mid-19th century, no such diagnoses were made. She clearly suffered from depression and delusions, was possibly bipolar, and had numerous physical problems as well, such as diabetes and poor vision. Abraham started his political career as a local politician in Illinois in the mid-1840s, serving in the state legislature. It wasn't uncommon for individuals in leading professions like the law to hold such positions in the states at the time, and Abraham doesn't appear to have considered a career on the federal level of politics at this juncture. After a few years as he and Mary started their family, Abraham stepped back from politics and concentrated on his law practice. What drew him back into political life and onto the national stage was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opened the way for the extension of slavery into the new territories being created by the US government in the West. Lincoln soon emerged as a prominent figure within the newly formed Republican Party, which was anti-slavery and had only been established in 1854. Through a somewhat unusual series of events, he was catapulted from relative obscurity to become the Republican Party candidate in the 1860 US presidential election. Mary would be a stalwart, if sometimes unorthodox, support for Abraham on the campaign trail. She encouraged his growing political ambitions throughout the 1850s, and we might never have heard of Abraham Lincoln had it not been for Mary's urging of him to put himself forward for the presidency. She also seems to have had a hand in devising some of his political views. Conversely, she was seen as meddling by some sections of the press, while her willingness to bring journalists into the Lincoln home in Illinois and give them tours was viewed as eccentric. Abraham clearly viewed her as a partner in his career. When he won the election in 1860, he greeted her with the words, "Mary, we are elected." The position of the First Lady of the United States was one which had only entered the lexicon of US public affairs since the 1830s. Mary relished the role, though it was a difficult one for her and Abraham as well. The American Civil War broke out just months into Lincoln's time as president, owing to the belief that the new president intended to abolish slavery across the Union. Coming from a slave-owning background in Kentucky, Mary had many close relatives who fought on the side of the Confederacy, and several of her half-brothers were killed in action. However, she was vocal in her support for the Union and the cause of abolition. That said, she also generated controversy, in particular owing to her lavish spending on banquets and formal events at the White House, fine jewelry, and interior decoration, at a time when the rest of the country was suffering under the burden of the war, with many people lacking many of the basics of daily life. To those who knew how the Lincoln White House operated, they also viewed Mary as a meddling figure who distracted her husband from the important business of wartime government, with her frequent bouts of depression, mania, and generally erratic behavior. Her mental state was particularly bad in 1862, after she received news that her son William, or Willie, had passed away from typhoid fever. She was so devastated that she was bedbound for around 3 weeks, didn't attend the funeral, and was taken care of by a nurse for months. Lincoln had only barely won the 1860 election, owing to the divided nature of the Democratic Party at the time over the slavery issue. His popularity grew over time though, as did Mrs. Lincoln's reputation, in large part owing to her charitable work in the hospitals of the Washington, D.C. and Maryland region as the war went on. The Union would eventually emerge victorious in the conflict, ending slavery in the United States in the process. Mary had high hopes that she might become a more settled First Lady thereafter, but one John Wilkes Booth had other ideas. Booth was an actor and a supporter of the Confederacy who on the 14th of April 1865 assassinated President Lincoln while he and Mary were watching a performance of the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. Mary was holding her husband's hand when he was shot in the back of the head. He would not die until the morning of the 15th of April after being in a coma for several hours. Mrs. Lincoln had to be removed from the room at one point. Such was the level of her trauma. Mary Lincoln received considerable sympathy in the aftermath of her husband's assassination. The couple had suffered so much during the war, and now when it all seemed to be over and the war won, Mary's husband had been cruelly taken from her. Amongst the messages of condolences she received was a letter from Queen Victoria of Britain, a woman who had lost her own husband Prince Albert 4 years earlier in 1861, and who would never fully recover from the loss, wearing black mourning clothes for the rest of her life. Despite the messages of sympathy, Mary Lincoln soon found herself in something of a financial bind. Abraham had been successful both as a lawyer and as a politician, and had left her a sizable estate of well over $2 million in today's money. But Mary had always been a spendthrift, and her time as First Lady had only made these instincts worse. By 1868, she was advertising in the national media that she was broke and needed financial aid as the poor widow of the murdered president. She would spend many years thereafter trying to put herself on a better financial footing and living on financial support from family, friends, and former political allies of her husband. At one stage, this involved her and one of her sons, Todd, moving to Europe to live in Frankfurt with the Seligman family, Joseph Seligman being a Jewish German who had migrated to the United States, where he became a very successful businessman and helped raise an enormous amount of money for the Union war effort during Lincoln's presidency. Eventually, in the early 1870s, Congress voted an annual pension for Mary, but she was never on a sound financial footing after she squandered the estate her husband left on his death. The financial issues Mary faced after her husband's death placed a considerable strain on her always fragile mental health. This was compounded by the publication in 1868 of a book entitled Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, by Elizabeth Keckley. Keckley was a former slave who had become an employee of the Lincolns as a dressmaker, and later a close confidant and friend of Mary Lincoln. Mary considered the publication of the book, which included a huge amount of personal revelations about her and her deceased husband, a serious betrayal, and many people at the time considered it as being in bad taste. The result of all of this unrest and instability in her life, combined with the death of her son Thomas or Todd, possibly from tuberculosis or a heart condition in 1871, led to a serious further decline in Mary Lincoln's mental health. She became erratic, paranoid, and prone to delusions. This culminated in 1875 when she visited her only surviving son Robert and became convinced that he was drastically ill, when in reality, the opposite was the case. During her visit with him, she told him that someone had tried to poison her on the train. She also spent large amounts of money on items she never used, and walked around the city with tens of thousands of dollars in government bonds sewn into her clothes. Eventually, Robert decided to have his mother committed. An insanity trial followed, one which generated a lot of public attention, given that it involved a former First Lady. Shortly after the court proceedings, Mary was in such a bad state of mind that it seems like she tried to take her own life. Well, she went to several pharmacies and ordered enough laudanum to kill herself, but an astute pharmacist picked up on this and instead gave her a placebo. Initially, Mary was committed to Batavia Asylum in Illinois, but thereafter complications in the case notably the fact that Robert controlled his mother's finances and was deemed by many observers, possibly quite unfairly, to have ulterior motives in seeking to have his mother committed, began to emerge. Eventually, in 1876, Mary was declared to be competent enough to look after herself, and was given her liberty. It certainly was an unpleasant event in her life, and while Robert's character was called into question at the time, there is little doubt that Mary Lincoln's psychological state was not good in the 1870s. Mary headed back to Europe after the insanity case, and spent several years travelling in France and elsewhere. Her health declined further during these years, a development in large part attributable to several falls she suffered during her travels. By the early 1880s, at which time she was still just in her early 60s, she was back in America, and increasingly confined to her sister's house in Springfield, Illinois. She died there on the 16th of July 1882 after suffering a fall, one which quickly led to a coma and a heart attack. She was 63 years of age. One of the few saving graces of the troubles of her later life was that she and Robert did reconcile shortly before her death. Mary has generally been judged as a very average or even poor First Lady by historians, her various difficulties having distracted her husband from his official duties in a time of national crisis, though in recent times a more sympathetic portrait of her has emerged, not least following her portrayal by Sally Field in Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln. Adele Hugo was the daughter of one of France's most famous writers. She had a good early life, but family tragedy and romantic problems would cause her great sadness. In time, she fell into madness, with many believing this was schizophrenia. So how did this happen to her, and why would she stalk someone for over 15 years? To find all this out, let's go back to the beginning. Adele Hugo was born on the 24th of August 1830 in Paris, the capital of what was then the Kingdom of France. Adele was named after her mother, Adele Foucher, and her father, as you may have guessed, was Victor Hugo. Her parents had 5 children. Their first child, Leopold, was born in 1823, but died in infancy. Next came a daughter, Leopoldine, born in 1824. Another son, Charles, was born in 1826, followed by Francois Victor 2 years later, and finally, Adele. To properly understand Adele's life, we need to look at her parentage. As you may know, her father was one of the most acclaimed writers of the 19th century. When Adele was born, he was an author in his late 20s with a little reputation, but he was working on a certain book entitled The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which would establish his name in French literary circles, and he would go on to write many other famous works. Amongst these, Les Miserables is unquestionably the most famous. Victor's fame as a writer would see Adele move in literary and cultural circles for much of her life, but as we will see, his political views and other factors would also lead to the family's exile from France. But was it this exile that would lead to Adele's mental instability, or was it the result of something else entirely? Before we answer that, let's look at her early life. Adele's early life was privileged. She grew up during a time when France was adopting the new technological innovations that had fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain since the 1770s. With this came wealth and a new middle class of readers who could read the kinds of books her father produced. As a result, the Hugos were financially stable and in time would prosper. Adele received a good liberal education for a girl by the standards of the 19th century. She also learned to play the piano very well and mixed with many leading cultural figures of the age who called Paris their home. As she grew up, Adele became known for her long dark hair and beauty, and was even painted by some of the capital's artists that knew her father. There is a photograph of her from 1850, not long after the first daguerreotype cameras became available. This reveals a woman of 20, of a handsome visage, though with something of a mournful look, certainly not that of a joyous young woman on the cusp of entering into her adult years in a culturally buoyant city like 19th century Paris. There could be many reasons for her sad look. Perhaps it was owing to her unfulfilled desires, or maybe the family tragedy. In 1846, when she was just 16 years old, she had become infatuated with Auguste Vacquerie. He was 10 years her senior, at 26 years of age. He was also related to Adele by marriage, his brother Charles having married Adele's older sister, Leopoldine. Adele and Auguste appeared to have considered marriage for a time, but the relationship wouldn't last, as Auguste hadn't proposed, and Adele eventually lost interest. Her eye now wandered to the sculptor Jean-Baptiste Clesinger, but nothing came from this. So, why did Adele lose interest so quickly? Perhaps her parents had simply disapproved of the potential union with Vacquerie, as the marriage of his brother Charles and Adele's sister Leopoldine had ended in tragedy. On the 4th of September 1843, Leopoldine and her husband were holidaying near Villequier in Normandy when their boat overturned. The couple drowned together as a result, with Leopoldine's wet, heavy skirts pulling her down, and her husband died trying to save her. Leopoldine had been pregnant, and her death left her father devastated. Hugo was travelling at the time and first learned of the tragedy after reading about it in the local newspaper. Following this, he developed clinical depression and was unable to write for several years. Perhaps the thought of Adele marrying into the same family troubled the Hugos. These early relationships in Paris in her late teens foreshadowed her tumultuous love life in years to come. Maybe it was because of these early family traumas that Adele carried a sad look on the day her photograph was taken in 1850. In the years that followed, different things would disturb her and the other members of her family. During a series of revolutions, which swept across virtually every nation in Europe in 1848 and 1849, Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had built and lost a great French empire between 1799 and 1815, was elected president of a newly declared Second French Republic. Unhappy with this constitutional form of power, Charles-Louis dismantled the Second French Republic in the early 1850s and declared himself to be Emperor Napoleon III of the Second French Empire. Adele's father had been a supporter of the French monarchy in his youth, but by the late 1840s was a passionate Republican. He made his opposition to Napoleon III's seizure of absolute power well known, and the family was forced to flee into political exile in 1852. They did not go far though, relocating to the island of Jersey in the Channel Islands, just off the coast of Normandy in northern France, though they were later asked to move to Guernsey, one of the other Channel Islands. The Hugos would live there for the next 20 years, and it was during this time that Adele's life would change, for the worse. Adele's story begins to become distinct from the lives of the rest of the Hugo family following their relocation to the Channel Islands. A year and a half after arriving to the archipelago, which were then and still are a British territory, despite their proximity to the French mainland, she met Albert Pinson, known to his friends as Bertie. He was a junior officer in the British Army who was 22 years of age at the time to Adele's 24. He began courting her, and the following year he proposed to her. Things then took a strange turn. Adele initially rejected his offer of marriage, perhaps because her parents disapproved of Pinson, who was fond of both drinking and gambling. But then, in the course of 1856, she had a change of heart. Pinson, though, did not have the reaction she had hoped for. Pinson was no longer interested, in large part because when Adele began pursuing him, her behaviour had changed. She was now displaying signs of some form of mental illness, one which is believed today to have been schizophrenia. It was the beginning of a long and painful mental decline, and how she lived the next 15 years of her life will shock you. The rest of the Hugo family, as we have seen, would continue to live on in Guernsey through the 1850s and the entirety of the 1860s before returning to France. Adele was not with them throughout many of these years. From 1856 onwards, she visited England frequently in her pursuit of Captain Pinson, who was stationed between London and his regiment in the county of Bedfordshire, in eastern England. Adele followed him here not long afterwards. This was the beginning of a period of nearly a decade and a half, during which she stalked the young captain across several countries and continents. Historians have identified that Adele was suffering from erotomania, a condition which causes a person to become convinced that someone who is actually disinterested in them is obsessed with them. Of course, this condition is responsible for many stalking cases in the modern world. Adele's pursuit of Pinson was nothing if not colourful. He did not remain for long in Bedfordshire, and was subsequently sent to Ireland, at that time a constituent part of the United Kingdom. He would remain stationed around Britain and Ireland until 1861, something which at least ensured that Adele's infatuation with Pinson kept her in the relative proximity to the Channel Islands and her parents. However, beginning in the early 1860s, he was appointed to a series of positions overseas. These included the city of Halifax in Nova Scotia in Canada, which prior to 1867 was still a series of full British colonies, as well as a stint on the island of Barbados in the Caribbean. Adele followed him to both locations overseas. During these years, her mental state was declining exponentially. While in Halifax, her behaviour became even more obsessive, regularly visiting the barracks and harassing Captain Pinson. He constantly rejected her and even extorted money from her. Despite all this, Adele wouldn't stop, and she went so far as to consult a hypnotist to put him into a trance and force him to marry her. During this time, her mother's health was deteriorating, and her family begged her to return home. Adele, though, couldn't stay away from Pinson, and was certain he would soon propose. Then, in late 1863, she wrote to her parents that she had finally married Pinson, and her father announced the news in the local paper. Yet, they later found out that this was a lie. 3 years later, Pinson was stationed in Barbados, and Adele, of course, soon followed. While in Barbados, she referred to herself as Madame Pinson, despite the fact that the captain would soon marry another woman. Adele was known to wander the streets muttering to herself, and had started to show little interest in maintaining herself, eating infrequently, and neglecting her own physical health. While living in Barbados, her mental decline was so severe that she stopped writing in the diary that she had kept while living in the Channel Islands and Halifax. Also, Adele hardly ever corresponded with her parents back in Europe, and so they were unable to track her activities and well-being. Because of this, we are limited in the amount of information concerning her life in Barbados, but there is enough evidence from later accounts of those who observed her on the island to know what happened to her. Still undeterred, Adele tried to establish contact repeatedly with Pinson, directly and through letters, but despite some brief interactions, it seemed like there was no possibility of any kind of the relationship redeveloping between them. So, would this finally put an end to Adele's stalking of Pinson? Adele finally gave up her pursuit of Captain Pinson in the early 1870s, after he had returned to Europe and married Catherine Edith Roxburgh, the daughter of a senior commander in the military. Their union soon resulted in a child, all developments which Adele, even in her weak mental state, could not ignore. And so in 1872, at 41 years of age, she returned to France. There her father had also finally relocated to Paris after the nearly 2-decade-long reign of Emperor Napoleon III, who abdicated his throne late in 1870 in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War. A few years prior, in 1868, while Adele was pursuing Pinson, her mother had died. In the French capital once again, Adele joined her father, but upon spending time with her, he soon realized that she was in a terrible mental state and decided to have her committed to a series of asylums where she would live out the rest of her long life, notably in Saint-Mandé and Suresnes, 2 suburbs of Paris. Victor continued to support her until his death in 1885. There she displayed symptoms of severe schizophrenia, such as hallucinations, and often didn't recognize acquaintances who visited her, traumatized by both her experiences in her youth fleeing France, her doomed pursuit of Pinson, and also the deaths of several of her siblings prematurely. She was the only one of her father's 5 children still alive at the time of his death in 1885. Adele wasn't the only member of the Hugo family to suffer from mental illness. Her paternal uncle, Eugène Hugo, is also believed to have had schizophrenia and fell into depression and madness after his younger brother married his secret love. This, of course, was Adele's mother. The esteemed French journalist and writer Gustave Simon remembered Adele in her later years at the convalescent homes in Saint-Mandé and Suresnes, where she spent much of the second half of her life. He described a woman who was relatively lucid and willing to talk about her early life, sharing fond memories of her father and the cultural figures she had known in Paris, all signs that her condition did improve over the years. She had a great love of music and what Simon called old-school composers. She played music herself and read voraciously in French, Latin and Greek. As such, it was not an entirely sad life that she lived here down to her death on the 21st of April 1915 at 84 years of age. Adele was subsequently buried at Villequier churchyard in the region of Normandy, where her sister Leopoldine had drowned nearly 3/4 of a century earlier. Curiously, Captain Pinson died just a few months after she did. There has been considerable interest ever since she was alive herself in Adele's story. In particular, her relationship with Pinson has garnered extensive attention. The most striking example of this was the appearance in 1975 of a film on the subject, directed by the great French New Wave director François Truffaut. The story of Adele H starred a 20-year-old Isabelle Adjani as Adele in the role that launched her career. The film's depiction of her doomed relationship with the captain garnered critical acclaim. Adjani was nominated for an Oscar in the Best Actress category, the youngest nominee in the award's history at that time. Adele's story was also the subject of numerous books over the last several decades. It has been retold with fresh perspective in a book by Mark Bostridge, In Pursuit of Love, just published in 2024. Thus, while her life story was tragic, Adele Hugo's tale continues to fascinate over a century and a half after her doomed pursuit of Captain Pinson. Lucia Joyce was the only daughter of James Joyce, the author of Ulysses, and one of the most significant writers of the interwar period. Lucia was a noted beauty and a talented dancer, but in the 1930s, her mental health began to go downhill. After this, she was locked away in asylums for over 50 years, and was then written out of history. Join me as we explore her story. Lucia Anna Joyce was born on the 26th of July 1907 in the port town of Trieste in the northeast of the Kingdom of Italy. This small city is located on the Adriatic Sea, near the modern-day border between Slovenia and Italy, but back then it bordered the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is impossible to understand Lucia's life story without exploring who her parents were. Her father was James Joyce, an Irishman who became one of the most influential literary figures of Europe in the 20th century. He authored works such as Dubliners and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. However, his most famous work was Ulysses. Joyce is widely regarded as having established many of the elements of avant-garde literature and modernism. Lucia's mother was Nora Barnacle, a woman from a poor family in Galway in the west of Ireland, but who had moved to Dublin when still a child. She met Joyce there in 1904 and they began a relationship. Despite the fact that Joyce's works were nearly always set in Dublin and Ireland, the pair left the island within a few months of meeting each other, and would never return for any sustained period of time, establishing their home in Trieste. Lucia's older brother Giorgio was born there in 1905, and she followed 2 years later. After Nora suffered a miscarriage in 1908, she would not have any further children. The small family lived during Lucia's early years in Trieste. At this time, Joyce was not an established writer, and it was a precarious existence for them, with the family often surviving on small bequests from patrons that James acquired, such as Ettore Schmitz, a writer himself who believed Joyce had potential. But it was a difficult period. When Lucia was born, Joyce was recovering from rheumatic fever, which had incapacitated him for weeks. This caused him to briefly give up alcohol, which he was a heavy partaker of for most of his life. Although Lucia's first years were spent in Trieste, she was too young to remember the period. Consequently, her most formative years in the 1910s were experienced as an itinerant literary family. The Joyces briefly returned to Ireland, for instance, in the early 1910s, as Lucia's father attempted to acquire a position at University College Dublin teaching Italian. When this failed, they returned to Trieste. Shortly after this, James did acquire some success with the publication of Dubliners, but the outbreak of the First World War in the late summer of 1914 made living in Trieste increasingly hazardous. These dangers only got worse for the Austro-Italian border town after Italy entered the war against Austria-Hungary in May 1915. When Italy entered the war, the Joyces left Trieste and moved to Zurich in neutral Switzerland. They would live there for the remainder of the war before briefly returning to Trieste again in the late 1910s. It was a disruptive amount of moving around for a child, and by the end of it, as Lucia was entering her teenage years, she was already developing a strained relationship with her parents, particularly her mother Nora. Her early years had also made Lucia something of an international citizen. She grew up to be multicultural, and despite her Irish parentage, considered Italian to be her first language. Another peculiar feature of her upbringing was that her parents were not actually married, an unusual arrangement in the early 20th century. They would only finally marry in a London registry office in 1931. As we will see, her family troubles and relationships would play a role in her life choices and mental health. In 1920, Lucia's life and that of her brother and parents finally began to take on a note of greater stability when they moved to and settled in Paris. The Joyces would live here for the most part over the next 20 years, only eventually relocating when the Second World War led them to depart again for Zurich. However, while Paris brought initial stability, it was also here that Lucia would experience the first emergence of her mental health problems. These were exciting years in Paris. After the trauma of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic which followed it, the 1920s were a time of great economic growth and cultural revival in Europe and the Americas, and the French capital was the epicenter of this. The 1920s consequently became known as the Années Folles in France, the crazy years, as writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein made the city their home for periods of time. Lucia's father was emerging as one of the most successful and prominent writers of the era, following the publication of Ulysses in serialized form in the late 1910s. Owing to this, the Joyce home became a retreat for the gathering of many famous literary and cultural figures in 1920s Paris, and Lucia grew up around people such as Pablo Picasso, Asa Pond, Stein, Hemingway, and the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. We might speculate that growing up in such an environment brought certain pressures to bear on her, the need to achieve something from a cultural perspective, while surrounded by so many overachievers. Much of this was channeled in her early adult years, in her career as a dancer. Lucia first began dancing in 1922 when she was 15 at the Dalcroze Institute Yet it wasn't until 1925, when she was nearing her 18th birthday, that Lucia began training in a more serious manner. Her family's position within the cultural world of Paris in the 1920s afforded her connections with some of the leading ballet and contemporary dance instructors of the day. These included Raymond Duncan, a dance instructor, poet and artist, who was also the brother of the more famous Isadora Duncan, an American who was one of the leading pioneers of contemporary dance. Lucia also trained for a time under Margaret Morris, an English dance pioneer who had become acclaimed for introducing Celtic and Scottish elements into contemporary dance movements. She also started the first modern dance school in the English West Country back in the late 1910s. Today, charges of being a nepo baby would be levelled at Lucia for benefiting from her father's cultural connections, but there is no doubt that she was good. By 1928, she was accepted into a dance troupe called Les Six de Rhythm et Couleur, the Six of Rhythm and Colour. The sextet performed in the year that followed in Paris, Vienna and Berlin, while in 1929, Lucia was runner-up at the first International Festival of Dance held in Paris that year. After witnessing one of her performances during this period, a writer for the Paris Times remarked that Lucia Joyce is her father's daughter. She has James Joyce's enthusiasm, energy, and a not yet determined amount of his genius. When she reaches her full capacity for rhythmic dancing, James Joyce may yet be known as his daughter's father. But just as her career as a dancer was taking off, it came to a shuddering halt. In late 1929, Lucia suddenly abandoned her career as a dancer, telling her friends that she was not physically strong enough to continue as a dancer. The exact reasons for her decision have been a matter of considerable debate, with some historians suggesting that it was her father who put a stop to her career. Apparently, Joyce believed that his daughter's dancing career was too physically demanding and was causing Lucia lots of stress, worsening the already very difficult relationship between Lucia and her mother. It was around this time that she began a relationship with Samuel Beckett, an Irish writer living in Paris who was briefly her father's secretary. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature many years later in 1969. Their relationship was short-lived, as Beckett was involved with another woman and told Lucia that he was more interested in her father and his writing than he was of her. Lucia's decision to quit dancing, combined with the collapse of her relationship with Beckett, led to a dramatic decline in Lucia's mental health in 1930. Joyce would write to Harriet Shaw Weaver, one of his patrons, regarding this, stating that this led to a month of tears as she thinks she has thrown away 3 or 4 years of hard work and is sacrificing her talent. Things deteriorated further in the early 1930s. The exact nature of Lucia's malady is a point of contention, though there appears to have been elements of schizophrenia involved. At one point she was sent to Switzerland, where she spent time at the Burg-Helsli psychiatric clinic in Zurich, where the family had lived in the mid-1910s, and where James Joyce still returned on occasion for treatment for his prematurely failing eyesight. There, Lucia was treated for a time by Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst who had trained under Sigmund Freud, and later emerged as a rival to his mentor. These were strained years, with Lucia often suffering from violent outbursts which manifested towards her family, and her mother in particular. Lucia's deteriorating psychological state came to a head in 1935 during a visit to some relatives in the town of Bray, south of Dublin in Ireland. During the holiday, she lit a fire in the middle of the living room of her cousin's home and tried to unbutton the trousers of several male visitors to the house. She was also known to open the gas tap at night, flooding the house with the fumes until someone awoke and turned it off again. To cap things off, she then disappeared from Bray altogether and eloped to Dublin, where she spent nearly an entire week sleeping in doorways. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when she returned to Paris and her parents learned the full extent of what had occurred, they decided to have her committed to an asylum in Ivry-sur-Seine, on the outskirts of the French capital. Lucia would spend most of the next 15 years at Ivry, though she was sent for a time to St Andrew's Hospital in Britain for assessment. Her father and brother Giorgio would visit her at Ivry on Sundays over the next several years, but there is no record that her mother ever saw her again after she was committed. James was evidently very troubled by her condition, and the character of Mama Lucio in his 1939 novel Finnegan's Wake is likely based to some extent on Lucia. The visit stopped in the summer of 1940 when the Joyces fled Paris in the wake of the Nazi invasion of France and settled in Zurich in Switzerland. James died there just 6 months later, while Lucia's mother lived for another decade in the Swiss city before her own death. In 1951, Lucia was transferred from Ivry in France to St Andrew's Hospital in Northampton in England, where she had been examined back in the mid-1930s. She would spend the rest of her life here. This was on the request of Harriet Shaw Weaver, an English political activist and literary figure who had patronised her father James in years gone by, and who agreed to become Lucia's guardian in 1951, following the death of Lucia's mother. She often had visits from friends and acquaintances who had known the Joyce family in the 1920s and 1930s, including Harriet, who was aging by then. Chief amongst them was Samuel Beckett, her former suitor from the early 1930s, and her father's close literary acquaintance. By then, Beckett was a successful author himself, and when Weaver died in 1961, he financed her continuing care at Northampton. Meanwhile, her brother Giorgio only visited her once, in 1967. Lucia died from complications arising from a stroke on the 12th of December 1982, aged 75. She was the last surviving member of her family, Giorgio having died 6 years earlier. Following Lucia's death, her nephew Stephen took most of her writing and destroyed it. This included her correspondence with her father and apparently some poetry in a novel she had written. It seems as if her family tried to destroy any trace of Lucia. Her medical records were burnt, and Carl Jung had also destroyed all his notes in relation to his time with Lucia. Friends and acquaintances of the Joyce family were also encouraged to destroy any correspondence to do with Lucia, acting like she had never existed and erasing her from history. She was buried in Kinsthorpe Cemetery near St Andrews, where a ceremony near her grave is held each year on Bloomsday, a festival celebrating her father's greatest work, Ulysses. Plans have been brought up in recent years to have the remains of the Joyces repatriated to Ireland, while several books have appeared in the early 20th century, reclaiming Lucia's story from obscurity. Alice de Janz was an American heiress who had a very dark side to her and was constantly involved in scandals and tragedies. In 1927, she abandoned her husband and children and ran off with her lover. Yet, she was mentally unstable and would eventually shoot him and then herself. But was this the end of her shocking life story? Join me to find out. The woman who would become famous as Alice de Janz, Countess de Janz, was born in the city of Buffalo, New York, as Alice Silverthorne on the 28th of September 1899. Her father was William Edward Silverthorne, a leading textiles manufacturer and business magnate during the Gilded Age, and her mother was Julia Bell Chapin, who also came from a prominent family of new wealth. William's marriage to Alice's mother was just one of the many advantageous marriages of the time between a business magnate and a relative of another business magnate. Arrangements like these formed alliances between the rich and powerful, and mirrored the intermarriage of royalty and aristocracy back in Europe. Julia Bell's uncles were the Armour brothers, Philip and Herman, who controlled Armour & Co., the largest meat distributor in the world at the turn of the century. Thus, Alice was born into a very wealthy background. She was the couple's only child, but her mother would sadly die from tuberculosis in 1907, when she was still young. Her father would remarry soon after, and had several children through his second marriage. Yet, Alice's position as her mother's only daughter left her in line to inherit a sizable estate someday, albeit through her uncles or through her father, and money was never an issue during her life. Alice's early life was rather chaotic. Her father was an alcoholic and was never usually home owing to work. As a result, Alice was mainly raised by her German governess. William was also a very unconventional parent, to say the least, doing nothing to restrain Alice and actively encouraging her social life as she grew into her teenage years. This may sound fine to some, but the father-daughter relationship was peculiar in other ways, and one writer on Alice's life has contended that it may have been incestuous. This remains unproven, but what is more certain is that at one stage while visiting France in the 1910s, Alice's father introduced her as his mistress to numerous people. Perhaps it was a peculiar joke of some kind, though it all certainly points towards a difficult upbringing, which was made worse by her mother's early death. Eventually, one of Alice's uncles from the arm side of the family gained custody of her after battling her father in the courts on the basis that he was an unsuitable parent. For a time, the 14-year-old Alice went to live with this uncle. However, this did not lead to the end of the relationship between father and daughter, and she spent a lot of time with her father on lengthy visits to France in her late teenage years. Over time, she grew fond of France, and it even became her adopted homeland. Alice married when she was just 21 years of age. She spent the end of the 1910s in Chicago with extended family, and then returned to France where she met and began a relationship with Frédéric de Janz, a French count who had gained fame of a kind in France as both a motor racing driver and as a pilot in the nascent French Air Force during the First World War. They married after a short courtship of just a few weeks. 2 children, both daughters, named Nolan and Paola, were born in 1922 and 1924. Alice and her young family soon decided to settle in Paris. Upon marrying, Alice had received a sizable part of her inheritance, and combined, they had no concerns about money, even retaining a large household staff to look after many duties for them. Hence, while they had 2 young infants arriving one after another, Alice and her husband did little to take care of them, and were able to maintain a busy social life in the French capital. This was the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, the celebratory period of economic boom, jazz and partying across the Western world following the difficult years of the First World War. As we saw earlier, Alice's father put no limits on his daughter and encouraged her social life. Now a woman in her 20s and a mother, her excessive lifestyle continued, and the de Janzes socialized with some of the most well-known literary and artistic figures of the interwar period in Paris's jazz clubs. Yet, Alice wasn't just a sociable young woman. At times, she was erratic and eccentric, and courted notoriety. As would become clear though, her flamboyant personality only thinly disguised her somewhat unstable character. In 1925, the de Janzes left France for a time to join their friends, Lord and Lady Errol, in the expat colonial community which had sprung up in the Wanjohi Valley in Kenya near Nairobi. Kenya was a British colony at the time, and Nairobi had emerged as one of the major centres of colonial government in East Africa. Alice and her husband were enthused by the idea of spending time here, not least owing to Frederick's affinity for big game hunting. This community of Europeans and Americans in Kenya became known as the Happy Valley Set. Such was their taste for parties, excessive alcohol consumption, drug use, and the inevitable sexual promiscuity and regular infidelities that followed. It was during these years that Alice's liking for opiates began to become a considerable problem, and after this trip, her life would never be the same. Alice soon stood out amongst the residents of the Happy Valley for her mood swings, sarcastic sense of humour, and her beauty. She became known here as the Wicked Madonna, and it wasn't long before she had an affair with Lord Errol. Yet, this was short-lived, and her next romance would be of much greater significance. In Kenya, Alice met Raymond de Trafford, a son of the Baronet Trafford in the English aristocracy. She fell for him, and the two began a relationship, which quickly became something of an open secret within the Happy Valley set. Initially, her husband tried to ignore it, focusing on hunting and hoping that it wouldn't last. Nevertheless, it soon became clear that Alice was in love with de Trafford. Frederick would later refer to this as the infernal love triangle. Although initially hesitant, Frederick eventually looked to separate. He was spurred on by his family members, who were scandalized by Alice's unfaithfulness and her erratic behavior. They divorced in 1927, after a period in which Frederick had spent time in Paris while Alice returned to Kenya to be with de Trafford. It was perhaps more than just her affair that led to the divorce. A year later, Frederick published a book entitled Vertical Land, which was very much a biographical account of the Happy Valley set, and in which he commented on his wife's suicidal and unstable character. She was prone to severe mood swings, including bouts of depression exacerbated by her opium and alcohol habits. Much of this was genetic, and Alice clearly suffered from some kind of clinical depression or bipolar condition, and other members of her extended family had committed suicide in years gone by. With her husband gone, Alice's lover was about to learn exactly how unstable she could be. On the 25th of March 1927, while in Paris, he informed her that they could not marry, as his Roman Catholic family objected to the social scandal it might cause, and would disinherit him. Well, they knew Raymond had split up her marriage. This led to one of the most scandalous events in Alice's life. Just hours later, while the couple were travelling through the Gare du Nord station in Paris, where Raymond was due to catch a train to the English Channel and then a ferry to England, she shot Raymond in the chest before turning her pistol on herself in order to take both their lives. Miraculously, this wasn't the end of her and Raymond's story. After the shooting, the pair were rushed to the Lariboisiere hospital, where Raymond was in critical condition and would remain so for days. He nearly died, as the bullet had grazed one of his lungs. Alice, on the other hand, came out with a minor wound, and as she was expected to recover quickly, French police stood guard outside her room. She was to be charged with attempted murder once she recovered. Alice did little to protect herself from the prosecution. Though she claimed she regretted her actions, she openly admitted to a French gendarme when questioned that she shot Raymond, but mysteriously refused to say why. In the end, through a most peculiar set of circumstances, she would never be fully prosecuted. First, Raymond made a gradual recovery and returned to health. This occurred even as Alice's extended family was launching a media and legal campaign to protect her and the family business reputation, as the shooting had made international headlines. She was shipped off to a clinic to recover from her depression, admitting in interviews that she had attempted to kill herself on numerous occasions in the past. Then, when fully recovered months later, Raymond stated regarding the incident, "As we were about to part, she was kissing me. I told her I loved her, and again whispered to her not to take my decision as irrevocable. I even told her that we would meet again. As she was leaving me, she attempted suicide, but a movement on my part caused the weapon to be deflected. I am sure that she did not intentionally fire at me. The accident was due to my imprudence." Despite this declaration, Alice was tried on the 23rd of December 1927 on the charge of assault. The previous charge of attempted murder was dropped thanks to Alice's excellent lawyer, who convinced the examining magistrate that her chronic melancholy deadened her intelligence, making her mentally irresponsible at the time of the incident. During the trial, Alice's moments of crisis were highlighted, as was Raymond's declaration and the fact that this was a crime of passion. As a result, the trial resulted in little more than a minor suspended sentence and a financial fine. In 1928 she returned to Kenya and had a brief stint with Lord Errol, resuming their previous affair. Again, this was short-lived, as she was asked to leave the country and was soon back in Paris with de Trafford. For the next 3 years, Alice continued to pursue de Trafford, and they finally married in 1932. The events of 1927 and Alice's eventual marriage to de Trafford was not the end of her colourful life. She and Raymond returned to Kenya, though the authorities were reluctant to let her spend much time amongst the Happy Valley set, wary of her notorious past. They lived something of a nomadic existence thereafter between Paris, London, occasional brief visits to Kenya, and even a stint in Australia for Raymond. Curiously, their marriage collapsed within months of swapping vows in 1932, after a heated argument over their honeymoon destination. They divorced in 1937, by which time they had been separated for several years. De Trafford had been able to manage being shot by his future bride, but apparently marriage had been a step too far. The second half of the 1930s were years of increasing isolation for Alice. The jazz culture of the 1920s had ended, and new social movements had passed her by, while her increasingly erratic behaviour and the public scandal of the shooting had led many people distancing themselves from her. Lonely, she grew increasingly reliant on opiates and continued to fly around between countries, at times deciding she was going to return to live in America, and then just as quickly determining to return to old haunts in France and Kenya. Her children lived in Paris, but rarely saw her, generally being raised by Frederick's extended family, he having died of blood poisoning in 1933. They later described her in a way which one might a wayward aunt or uncle, who showed up once or twice a year with presents for the children, and disappeared again just as quickly. It was during this wilderness period that she became embroiled in the second great scandal of her life. On the 24th of January 1941, Lord Errol, the man who had been involved in first bringing the Janzes to Kenya a decade and a half earlier, had been found shot to death in his car near Nairobi. Suspicion quickly fell on Alice, owing to her known relationship with Errol, her unstable character, and her history of having previously tried to kill one of her lovers. Alice was questioned by police and was able to provide an alibi of sorts, but it was tenuous, and suspicion still circulated around her. In the end, there was not enough to charge Alice with Errol's murder. Investigative reporting over the years has drawn different conclusions. Some believe Alice was the most likely culprit. Others exonerate her and point the finger of blame at other members of the colonial expat community in Kenya at the time. We may never know for sure. Alice would not outlive Errol by very long. She was in poor health and was soon diagnosed with uterine cancer, for which she had to undergo a hysterectomy. Depressed about her isolation, her declining looks, and her spiraling drug abuse, she made 2 attempts on her life within 8 days at the end of September 1941. She succeeded on the second attempt by shooting herself with the same pistol she had used in the incident in the Gare du Nord in Paris 14 years earlier. She was 42 years old. When her house was searched after these events, suicide letters were found, and she even placed notes on pieces of furniture to give them away to people she knew. It was a peculiar end to a peculiar life. Thank you so much everyone for watching these stories on the socialites who society deemed as crazy. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the stories down below in the comments, and also let me know what you think of this Compilation format, I left in the intros. Let me know if you enjoyed it more. Anyway, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.